of this unit because they are not living things. Yet they have an impact on living things. So let's talk a little bit about viruses in terms of their size and their components. So the size of viruses are really tiny. Here's one of our cells, microscopic. Different kinds of bacterial cells. E. coli, look at the size of E. coli. Even in comparison, our cells, which are microscopic, all of these cells are microscopic, right? This is microscopic, the size of virus particles. That's why when someone coughs, if they have viruses in their respiratory system, they can float in the air for hours. Sometimes 12 hours a particle can be floating around in the air. So like this room, for example, it's a lot better for us to be in this room now because no one's been in it overnight. So all the virus particles have probably gone to the ground, maybe started to degrade. If you were in this room and there's been 6 classes in this room by nighttime, there's a lot of people who've been in here.
That's why I always think about it, like if someone have COVID and he's wearing a mask and he's freezing it back in, right?
Right. So
it will not get better,
well, your body's already in a state of the immune system is at a height.
Yeah, but still it's
But you might have over time you'll have less virus particles in that sneeze because your body's been fighting it.
Oh.
Yeah. And your immune system is heightened. So it's kind of like the immune system is like an army. Think about like an attack system that when there is something going on that needs protecting, that you might have like a security guard, right? And then the security guard calls the police. And if it's really bad, the police call more police. And then if it's really bad, the police call the National Guard. And so you go from having like 1 to maybe 3 to 10 to 50 to 4,000.
And this is cause like trouble to the body.
Yes. Yeah. So your immune system kind of ramps up by getting everybody else activated to fight this other thing off. The other thing too is that fevers, as I mentioned, fevers help anything that's attacking our body to kind of be suppressed, and it gives a little boost to our immune system. So we've got that also working for us. So there's a lot of different activations within our body that happen when we're sick that give us an advantage. So virus particles, teeny weeny, little tiny virus particles. Let's talk about some of the general characteristics of viruses. They are very simple. Viruses have 2 major parts. To be classified as a virus particle, they have some kind of hereditary material, could be DNA, could be RNA. A lot of the classification of viruses start here. They figure out, is it a virus that's carrying DNA? Is it a virus that's carrying RNA? That hereditary material has a protective coat, a protein coat on it. Sometimes they have a lot of protein coats. They could have a few protein coats. And then also sticking out from the protein coats, they'll have little receptors that'll allow them to stick to the cells that they target, or the organism that they target. So in the least, they have this. Okay, so why are they not categorized as a living thing? Because they cannot live on their own. There's a whole bunch of characteristics that qualify something as being living. If you were to think about the definition of a living thing, so sit there and conjure up, define in your head what a living thing is. It's complex. There's a lot of things going on in order to classify something as a living thing. In addition, they don't have all of the organelles, right? If they only have a protein coat and a genetic material, how do they replicate themselves? Well, they don't have the machinery to do that. And the machinery, what we mean by that, is we mean all these other organelles they don't have. They don't have ribosomes to capture energy and convert it. So there's a lot of things that they can't do on their own. What do virus particles look like? So here's illustrations of virus particles, and here's what they really look like. Remember, again, they are teeny, 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 weeny. So we're going to talk about tobacco mosaic viruses. They're like a cylinder inside. They have RNA. Adenoviruses, these cause the common cold, as well as other kinds of diseases. They're very geometric in their shape. They have DNA inside. And remember I said those little attachments, they have attachments to attach into our respiratory cells. Influenza viruses, these cause flu. These are flu viruses. They're circular and they have a lot of attachment sites to get in. They have RNA in terms of their genetic material. And these are just like wild to me with their construction. These are called bacteriophages. Don't they look like a spaceship? It's pretty cool. I mean, the way they have evolved their protein coat is pretty sophisticated. Yeah, right? And they have DNA inside. They have a head, they have a neck, they have a tail, they have injection sites. Look at that. Yeah. Amazing, amazing, the evolution of those in particular. This is the HIV virus. The HIV virus is super sophisticated. It has inside of it, it has RNA as its genetic material. It actually has reverse transcriptase, which helps the RNA to be made into DNA, and then the DNA codes for the ability to make more of its components, and that helps our cells to accelerate in terms of replicating the entire virus. It also has a protein coat, two protein coats, and a lipid coat. Very similar in a lot of ways to our own cells, so that our own cells are like, okay, yeah, you look similar. All right, that's cool. And then all of these attachment spikes on there. You have a picture of this. So take a look at that picture on your page. I don't know why it's not coming up. So when they advertise these things, this one actually is different kind of thing than what this should look like to you. But what's wrong with it? It's like, okay, yeah, the box is pretty. Maybe you don't like it. You're like, that's what's wrong with it. It's not pretty to me. It kills much less than what they claim. It kills 100% of viruses. Viruses aren't alive, so it can't be killed. Yeah. So when it says something like kills viruses and bacteria, well, maybe kill is not the right word, right? Because kill is associated with something making a living thing not live anymore. So let's talk about the characteristics of life. So all of these things in terms of that definition that you were thinking of, were you thinking of all of these things? That a living thing grows. So remember, a virus can't grow on its own. A living thing reproduces. Viruses on their own cannot make copies of themselves, so they cannot reproduce on their own. Viruses don't respond to stimuli. So they can't just like, if they wanted to move out of the way, they can't do that. Whereas if I threw something at you, your response wouldn't be like, cool, she's gonna throw that at me, I'm gonna let it bounce off my head, right? If I threw this at you, you would react by responding to that stimulus of moving out of the way for your own survival and protection. They can't maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is a word that means to kind of maintain a regular field in your organism. You want to make sure everything's regulated on a regular basis. They can't get energy. They don't photosynthesize. They don't have mitochondria to process energy. They don't have complex organization. Living things have complex organization, meaning that they at least have a bunch of organelles that help to do all of these other things. And here's the one that I disagree with. Some textbooks say yes and some textbooks say no. says they can evolve, but here's the thing. With a host, they can evolve. But on their own, if they're just floating around, do they have the ability to copy themselves to reproduce, which in the process of reproduction means the copying of your genetic material from the parent to the daughter organism or to the offspring. They can't do that. And so if they can't reproduce and in reproduction copy their genetic material, can they make mutations? They can't on their own. But with getting into their target organism, the target organism helps them to copy their genetic material. And the target organism, is that what makes them evolve? Yeah, so you have a target organism that is helping them to make more of themselves. So that's where this one's a little like iffy. If you think about it, it's like, well,
I think that one can be classified as like the same way you classify whether they can reproduce or not. Like they can't reproduce on their own, and they also can't, like, I think those two kind of go hand in hand.
Right. So when viruses,
because evolution can only happen through reproduction.
so regardless, even if you say yes to this, I say, I don't think so. You have to meet all of these criteria, every single one, to be classified as a living thing. So even if you meet one or two, you're still not a living thing. Okay, so viruses are not categorized as living things. That's why there are no domains, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species to them. They get named, and they get named usually in regard to whatever they infect. But, like I mentioned before with bacteria, they are specific to their host and often very specific to the cells in which they can infect. So, bacteriophages. Here's them in real time, infecting a bacterium. Look at this. That one is just injecting, this one here, they're injecting their genetic material in, pushing down. These ones have already done it, and they're just like the rest of their body starts to disintegrate. So they're kind of disintegrating away. So they are very host specific. So influenza viruses. Kinds of influenza viruses may attack us, Homo sapiens, but again, only our respiratory cells. And like you all said before, just because you could cough onto your hand, just because you could cough onto your hand and then touch your face, it doesn't mean this is infected, it just means this is carrying it to the cells that are susceptible to infection. So how are viruses treated? There are antiviral drugs. And so what the antiviral drugs do is they help the host to lower the ability of the virus to replicate in the cells of that specific body.
How about flu shots?
We're going to get to that. Very good question. So we'll get there. Mutations that we make or assist in the copying of the genetic material of new virus particles can keep them effective and changing. So we have definitely seen that with COVID, right? We have all these different iterations of COVID, and as it keeps passing from person to person, or persons, groups of people, you see new different kinds popping up all the time. We keep naming them, right? We name all of these different iterations of them. So antiviral drugs, again, they could keep the virus effective and give a boost to that host, but what if in the host copying the genetic material assists the virus in making mutations that make them resistant to the antiviral drugs? So, yeah, right, exactly. And that's the whole thing with like COVID, for example, is that the passing of the viruses around to each other, we're just assisting the viruses and having new different kinds and evolving in different ways. So the less we pass on viruses to each other, the less we assist them in making mutations to make them ineffective to our treatments. So a little bit about the common cold. So adenoviruses, there's more than 200 of these kinds. The big thing is in the wintertime that viruses, because of humidity, so here's the thing about like the environment, that the humidity in the air, that it's a lot more humid in the summertime when it's hot, right? Because you have precipitation and evaporation that's driven by more sunlight, longer days, which also, it depends on like the time of year, the tilting toward the sun, that we have a lot of things that happen in the summertime, is that we have more ability of longer days, tilting toward the sun, more heat. And with more heat, you have more evaporation and precipitation, which means that you have a lot more water particles in the air. It's more humid. As we turn away from the sun and it gets colder, we have less of that precipitation and evaporation because it's cold, right? It stays on the ground as frozen, stays in the clouds move pretty quickly. And so we have less of that kind of the water particles that could interfere with the floating of viruses around. So when we have it drier in the winter, virus particles can float for much longer amounts of time, as opposed to when it's humid, they might get caught on a piece of water and go down to the ground quickly, so they can't float. Yeah.
That means that there are like more viruses in like deserts?
Hypothetically, yes. But they would float around a lot more. It also depends on wind, because deserts usually don't have a lot of like trees. There might be more wind in those areas that would blow the virus particles away. So it all depends on a lot of factors, right? Like it's really windy today. So today, for example, if we had a big congregation of people outside, it'd be pretty safe, because any virus particles, somebody coughs and immediately it'll get blown away. So a lot of things, yeah, you have to, but hypothetically, yes. Common cold causes the rhinovirus. Rhino, rhinoceros, what do they have a big? They have a big horn, right? A big face. So we're talking about, when we're talking about rhinoviruses, we're talking about they get infections, typically start and originate around our faces. They account for about 10 to 40% of what we would call the common cold, or the adenovirus group. So adenoviruses, rhinoviruses, coronaviruses are part of common colds in that category. Respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, which is going around a lot right now too. And then there's a lot of other things that cause the common cold. So when we say cold, it means a lot of things. It means basically like a respiratory virus that we have that reacts in pretty much the same way, right? You get coughing, you get a sore throat, you get a lot of nasal drip and congestion in general. So medications. There's no antivirals for the common cold, typically, right? Like for example, the coronavirus has like Paxlovid, for example. So in some specific cases, yeah, we might have an antiviral that gives us that boost. Antibiotics are not useful for viruses. Everybody hear that? Antibiotics are not useful for viruses. So, if you go to the doctor, you test positive for COVID, and you're like, and then you go in there, and they're like, oh yeah, okay, you tested positive for COVID. There's a couple things that you can get. Remdesivir is one, Paxlovid. Those two help with controlling the virus and the symptoms. They're an antiviral. But if they say to you, I'm going to give you penicillin, your next thing that you should do is say, why? And when they go, what do you mean why? Well, I tested positive for COVID. That's a virus. Why are you giving me penicillin? Penicillin treats bacterial infections. That's always what I do. And then the doctor's like, well, I mean, in case that you have a bacterial infection from your immune system being kind of overburdened, it opens you up to having a bacterial infection. And that's why I'm going to give you the antibiotic. And I say, well, how do you know that I'm going to get a bacterial infection that is going to be assisted by penicillin?
Yeah, specifically penicillin.
Penicillin specific to certain kinds of bacterial infections. How do they know that I am going to encounter a bacterium that penicillin will treat, as opposed to ampicillin, as opposed to erythromycin, opposed to, right, all of those different ones that you tested. And if they don't, if you go in, yeah, so that's the thing, is that we shouldn't, and that's a problem, is that a lot of times, like, what doctors think is like, we are consumers. We're not just patients, but we are someone who wants something in return. And so a lot of people go in and then they go, oh, you have COVID? Okay, here, take penicillin. And they're like, okay, cool, thanks so much. And they're happy because they got something, right? They went in to see this person and they got something in return. So they're like happy. They're happy consumers.
Sometimes like mentality, they just like when they take it, they feel better, but just mentally.
Right. So, like my mother-in-law had COVID symptoms, but the tests weren't in the fall. They weren't showing COVID. So the testing system, it was evading the testing system. But she had all of the symptoms, and I said, I think you have COVID. I think you should isolate. And she was given an antibiotic. And I said, don't you usually have like a digestive system reaction to antibiotics where after taking them for like 5 days, your stomach gets upset and you get diarrhea. And then your stomach is upset and you have diarrhea for 4 days. But why are you don't take that antibiotic. And she said, no, the doctor said it was gonna help the bursted blood vessels in her ear. And I was like, but COVID is a circulatory system disease. We know it attacks the circulatory system. It breaks down the walls of capillaries, which would cause them to burst, which then the doctor said, well, a lot of people are getting this bursting of blood vessels. And she said, and antibiotics is helping them. And I was like, but here's the thing, is that those burst blood vessels are going to be cleaned up by your immune system in 10 days, the same amount of time that a course of antibiotics is. So correlation, not causation, right? So here it's like the doctor is saying the antibiotic is cleaning up the burst blood vessels, when it's like, no, your body will clean those up. And just because you're taking the antibiotic doesn't mean the antibiotic cured that thing. But my mother-in-law was like, yes, I got something and I'm gonna take it. But then what happened after 5 days? She was really digestively sick.
Another patient carries.
Right, a happy consumer. So make sure if you go to the doctor, you ask questions. When you are given an antibiotic, there should be some kind of a swab, right? How did we do the E. coli? We swabbed them onto an agar plate and grew them for 2 days. Some bacteria can have a rapid test, but it still involves swabbing of where you would have the bacterial infection. So if there's no swabbing that happens and no rapid test or no sending off of that swab to a lab and getting the results in 2 to 3 days, you should not take an antibiotic. Remember that. And remember that as a lot of you are going to become medical professionals, remember that. Okay, so medications for the common cold. Decongestants can help to alleviate the runny nose, the coughing. Antihistamines. What happens is that when we get allergies, we'll go through that when we get into the immune system, is that, like, for example, I know that I have mold allergies, is that my immune system, even though the mold isn't going to hurt me, my immune system responds in an overreactive way. And it gives me those kind of like full-blown cold flu symptoms to attack those mold pollen pieces but it should be like, my immune system should just gobble them up, but not cause this whole overreaction. One of the things that happens is that in that overreaction, I release histamine. Histamine causes our mast cells to cause the production of water and calling the immune system to that area. So that extra water and the immune system coming, the histamine, an antihistamine will cause me to produce less histamine, which causes less water and less calling of the immune system. To help your sore throat, you could make a little bit of like salt water and gargle. That sometimes helps to dry up that area so that you don't have, again, that overreaction of the histamine and the mast cells and the water. You could take some things like Tylenol, for example. Drinking plenty of fluids can soothe your sore throat, right? Especially like warm liquids or honey.
Is there
Yeah.
Why do people always say like when you get sick, like eat something warm or drink something warm? Does that have like something to do with
Oh,
like?
it's super clean.
It feels better than cold. It has an effect to make your sore cells just temporarily not so sore. Yeah.
So like easier symptoms, basically.
Yeah, right. None of these things are going to cure you, but they are going to help you to feel less bad.
Okay, so it's not that you can't take them, it's just that people think it's like a cure for the cold, but really it's not. It's just easing your symptoms until your body.
That's why these things are not cures.
Okay.
There's no cure for the
Yeah.
common cold. These things assist in you feeling less
Okay.
awful. Rest, right? If you're asleep, you don't feel bad. You're just asleep. So that's why it's always like, my son always says, oh, I wish I could sleep on long car rides. Because he gets so anxious and he just wants to get there and he's excited. And he's like, if you sleep, it's like, I go to sleep and then I'm there. You like lose that amount of time. And so when you're sick, if you're sleeping, you kind of lose that amount of time that you don't feel so great.
That's
So
why I do it.
go to sleep.
That's how I do it.
And that's why you could take some like decongestants that have like NyQuil, the nighttime NyQuil,
Tylenol being
knocks you out, right? So that you don't feel, you're not awake and feeling badly.
That's what I do. I just sleep,
All
out,
these
I just
things.
sleep out the sick.
Sleep it out. It's like, that's why, and also when you're sleeping, you're not like spending energy doing other things. And so that lack of spending energy allows your immune system to take that energy and fight off what you're fighting. So there is like a kind of a double reason why you should sleep it off, is that you're saving a lot of energy. Okay, so on to next class of viruses, herpes viruses. Herpes viruses specifically attack mucous membranes, not just of the urogenital system, but they can also attack mucous membranes in your head. So probably about like 10 years ago, herpes was spreading wildly across college campuses because beer pong became very popular. And when beer pong became popular, you set up cups in a triangle, and then you fill them with beer, and then you have a triangle here, and on a long table, a triangle there, and people use a ping pong ball to throw, and if you throw it into the cup, you can make someone else drink that cup of beer. Well, everyone was sharing beer cups with their mouth, the mucous membranes of their mouth. So they were leaving herpes virus particles on the cups, and when that cup was shared amongst a whole bunch of people, it started to spread. So those of you who don't drink alcohol would never get it, right? Hypothetically. So unless you had sexual intercourse. But what if you don't do that either? Then you're safe. So this is kind of interesting. They found out that the genital herpes could be shared through the mouth area. And you know, cold sores, those are in the class of herpes viruses, and those viruses could be shared with the genital area. So like oral sex, for example, if somebody had a cold sore, they could transmit those virus particles to someone's urogenital area. So college, you learn things in college, right?
So have you ever gotten like a canker sore where like you accidentally bite your lip or something, or your mouth? Well, I don't know. I feel like growing up, everybody was always like, "Oh, if you have a canker sore, technically you have herpes." That's not true, is it?
I do not believe canker. I think that's caused by either usually like acid or like, yeah, you bite chewing gum and you bite the side of your mouth and that sore. It's open to like everything that you put into your mouth. So food, especially more acidic things, would cause that to sting. Or just food in general, touching a sore that you have in your mouth, that would cause it to sting. So I do not believe those are in this class.
Because growing up, people would say like, if you've ever gotten a canker sore, like ever, that means you typically have herpes. It's all herpes.
I don't know for sure, but I don't believe they're in the same class.
Okay.
I used to get them from like having, every time I had ketchup as a kid, I would get one. Acidic ketchup is tomatoes, which are acidic, but I don't get them as an adult. So I don't know, I'm not sure. Not sure about that particular thing. But if you regularly get, like every time it's, you know, exam time or final season and you get a cold sore, it's because you have that herpes virus in your body, and the herpes virus is expressed under times of stress. When your body is stressed out, it's like freaking out, right? And then it opens you up to any virus particles you have in your body from taking over for a bit. So same thing with the genital herpes, is that when people are stressed out, they can have an outbreak of it. There are different kinds of antivirals that will help to minimize the outbreaks as well. So there's all these things, like I know I see a lot of these Valtrex commercials pop up on YouTube, for example, is that that'll help to minimize the outbreaks of the genital herpes. But you will always carry that virus within your body. So this one is that the coating is recognized by the cell engulfs it, and then it merges with the nuclear envelope, releases its genetic material, and genetic material goes through just like the same thing in copying our own genetic material. And in copying the genetic material, it says, oh, let's make more of the parts that make more virus particles, and then it produces a whole bunch more and releases them within the cell. HIV. HIV causes AIDS. The human immunodeficiency virus is HIV. When a person goes from HIV stage into the AIDS phase, it means that this virus basically is not in a large quantity, it's like under control in the body, and then for whatever reason, it could be like a sickness, like the person gets pneumonia, and it causes them to go into the AIDS portion of kind of the life of the virus. So sometimes our cancer, like someone will get cancer, and then they simultaneously will have the AIDS portion of the life of the virus takes over. So this one's a tough one because the HIV virus, it actually attacks the T helper cells of our immune system. And so our immune system goes through a thing where it's like, it recognizes that there's a virus particle in your body, and there's ones that go and flag all of those virus particles in the body. And then, so you have like ones that recognize it, flag it, and then you have another class of them that just walk around, like, or swim around in your immune system, in your circulatory system, and they look for any flagged particles, and then they gobble up anything that's flagged. But there's also one kind of in the middle that gives a boost to the ones that are doing all the work, and that's the T helpers. And so if the T helpers don't give this boost to the ones that are flagging and the ones that are gobbling, then those don't work as well, and the virus particles can overtake the immune system. That's what HIV does. It doesn't allow for that boost to happen. So there's a combination. When someone is diagnosed with HIV, they have a bunch of antivirals and also other things to boost the immune system that will help to keep that virus from replicating in the body. What they have found too is that some of these antivirals are so effective that you can't even detect a person has HIV particles in their body anymore. So perhaps they are cured. And this is pretty fascinating. So one is that, remember before that I showed you the HIV virus, how it has a lipid layer, protein layers. It's got a lot of those attachment sites that our cells are like, oh, this is kind of like our cell. So our cell will easily, the HIV virus can easily merge with our own cellular membrane. So a lot of research needs to continue to be done on HIV. Because it's a worldwide problem. A lot of the lack of education of people in the world, they don't realize that they're passing HIV from one person to the next. HIV is passed from a blood-to-blood connection. So the two main ways that people contract HIV are through sex, and it would be sex where there is like a release of blood from the penis to the vagina, or if it's like anal sex, for example, that the anus tears and the penis has a release of blood, and so there's the blood-to-blood connection, or penis to vagina, and you have that blood, kind of like blood from the penis and blood from the vagina. The sharing of needles, of intravenous drugs, so that somebody who's like injecting themselves with some kind of drug, they often are just so addicted to that drug that all they want to spend money on is the drug and not new needles. And so then they often might even inject themselves, and they share that needle with somebody else. So some blood from when they injected got sucked into the needle, and then it goes to the next person. So that's another way that they are spread. HIV has a rapid mutation rate. So HIV as well as the flu have these very quick mutation rates. But again, remember that mutations can do one of three things. They can do nothing, they can make the thing worse, they can make it better. And so some of these mutations don't really have any effect on humans, and some of them change for the worse. So that's why constant research is being done on things like HIV, or we'll talk about the flu in a second. Like I said, HIV affects the immune system by getting in there, can destroy cells, can hinder the immune response. So it's kind of like this double issue too, is that the cells can actually, the virus can actually destroy cells. So here's some bright spots. Dr. David Ho, he has figured out an antiviral that can actually hinder many of the things that the HIV virus does. Also has figured out how to treat different mutations in the same way. So I figured out this mutation does this, this one does a similar thing, and this does a similar thing. So he's been designing antivirals that can hit all of those mechanisms. HIV has a lot of mechanisms in which it affects us negatively. And so it can, one, most importantly, inhibit the merging of the virus with our own cell membranes. And that's huge. Because if the virus can't get in to our cells, it can't replicate. It can't be replicated with the assistance of our cells, right? So this one is a big one. But there's also ones that help to not convert the RNA to DNA and then back again to make new virus particles. So it can have an effect on the genetic material, and also could have an effect on, maybe it makes the whole thing except for the attachment sites, which would, if you make new virus with no attachment sites, it's not going to attach anywhere. Flu is the same thing. Flu has a really high mutation rate. That's why every year you get the flu vaccine. People constantly are researching, what did the flu mutate to this year, the year before, the year before, the year before, and then they guess, what's it going to turn into next year? So sometimes the flu vaccine, it works, and some years it doesn't. But here's the thing. The flu vaccine also has some of the genetics that are found in the swine flu as well. So occasionally that zoonotic disease of swine flu, which can be very deadly at times, if you get the yearly flu virus, because I know a lot of people, or the flu vaccine, I know a lot of people will say like, I don't get it because I never get the flu. Well, that's all just kind of like a chance thing, right? But I always tell people, well, you should get it because you never know, like, what if you have pneumonia one year and then you get the flu? Now you've overburdened your immune system. So that getting the vaccine will potentially could help. But also in years like it seems like every 10 so years, the swine flu will pop up. And that gives you some protection from that too. So that's kind of a good idea. And when we say swine, it initiates with pigs or swine, and then can go to humans. The flu also, you never know. What if you have COVID and then you get the flu? Your immune system is overburdened by COVID already, and then you add the flu in. And could a healthy person then die? Yeah. So that's kind of the thing that if you don't have the flu vaccine, might not be a bad idea to go get one. They're usually like between $3 to $20. So not a bad idea, especially with COVID being around. Okay, let's go to lab. I'm just going to finish up this last bit because we're going to get to it. So I'll get to the last little bits of lecture in lab. And then all we have to do is finish lab 24. You have to turn in lab 24 today. You cannot. Sure. Mosaic viruses. If any of you grow plants, I know like my tomatoes, cucumbers often will get this, like, you can really see it here, where there's like dark and light, kind of like a mosaic pattern. That the mosaic pattern is caused by a virus. Now, there could be that virus is transmitted by like an aphid, so that if you also get the little like spider webby stuff around your mottled looking leaves, it could be transmitted through that aphid as well. So you've got two kind of attack systems going on here. They can be not only tomatoes, but other vegetables like beans, flowers, they have a lot of issues as well. So once you have this attack of this, that virus can spread throughout the plant. So then you have a little bit of trouble there. Pollen. Infected plants, when they produce pollen, and the pollen is transferred by pollinators or by the wind, also the pollen can be infected. So there we get all of these like compounding issues of this kind of virus. Now for us, like maybe it's just annoying in your garden that your tomatoes aren't producing really well because the leaves are getting attacked and they're smaller, and so then they're not like able to photosynthesize and thus help to grow the plant bigger, and you don't get as much tomatoes from a plant that's attacked by a mosaic virus. But what about like whole tomato farms or whole cucumber farms or farms where they grow a variety of things? That could cause a lot of money, and worldwide it could cause like shortages in things like tomatoes, for example. So the farmers have to be very careful about the mosaic viruses. Tobacco is another one. Tobacco oftentimes will get affected. Tobacco mosaic virus, I showed you that like it was like a cylinder shape. So again, this pattern, here's the pattern that you see, is that this is the way the virus is expressed in the plant, and often will cause like less production in your fruit as a result. All right, so you recently got the flu. You go to the doctor and they prescribe antibiotics. Why? Antibiotics will kill the flu virus?
No.
No. Antibiotics will stimulate an immune response? No. Antibiotics are always given when a person has the flu?
No.
Shouldn't be, right? Should not be. Your doctor is not trying to treat the flu virus, but any bacterial infections you might possibly get when a compromised immunity as your body fights the flu virus.
Isn't that still kind of like?
Yeah, that's not, I mean, that's what they're trying to do. But again, here's my caveat to that. Make sure if you have cold or flu-like symptoms or you have COVID, and they are like, here, take this erythromycin, you say, no, I don't do this. Why? No, don't do that. But say, why are you prescribing me this? I mean, perhaps if you shout it at them, they'll be like, oh, it'll really impact them. But maybe you don't want to do that. They might call security on you. But always ask, okay? All right, so last little bit. These are not viruses, prions. They are protein particles. No genetic material, but these proteins can have very adverse effects, specifically on our nervous system. A lot of research needs to be done in these areas because it's like, how could something that's just a protein, how's it replicated in our bodies? It doesn't have genetic material to code for the replication of itself. So this is a big mystery that needs a lot of research. So again, those of you who like to figure out puzzles and you're thinking, maybe I'll go into pharmacy or biomedical research, here's a whole nother field.
Nobody knows yet?
No, they're still, I mean, there might be specific kinds of prions that are figured out, but for the most part, a lot of these are just mysterious still. All right, so here's a bunch of the diseases that are caused by prions: Kuru, scrappy, mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt Jakob. I want to talk about Kuru. Kuru was discovered in the New Guinea tribe, the Four. And, okay, so I want to kind of like talk about this ritual cannibalism. It doesn't mean that they're like, ooh, this baby was born. Let's all cut it up and eat it together. That's not what that means. It's actually quite beautiful in the idea that when a person dies in the tribe, they eat the brain. Now you might be going like, wait, that's not beautiful. Here's the idea though, is that they believe that if you eat the brain of one of your elders who has accumulated a ton of wisdom in their life, that you, by eating the brain, will get that wisdom. So that's kind of beautiful, right? But it's caused them to have Kuru in their own brains, which has caused a lot of issues with their nervous system. And when it starts to really express itself, it starts with a lack of coordination, and then dementia. People start to forget things, they start to act differently, and then eventually it results in death.
So they got it because they were eating their brains?
Yeah.
So it's something there's a prion in the brain?
Mm-hmm. That they eat and it goes to their brains. Mad cow disease. So cows, what do cows typically eat? Grass, right? I mean, in the United States, a lot of our cows eat corn, and that's not good. It causes them to actually be sick by eating corn and not grass. It's a whole other lecture for a whole nother day. But what happened in Britain was that in those cow factory farms, they were like, hey, so when they cut the cow up and then you have the meat and all the other stuff that's cut off, like the brain, the eyeballs, the fur, bones, what if we grind that up and we put it into the cow food and we feed those cow parts back to the new cows, and then we could save on cow feed.
That's
But
gross.
yeah, it's super gross because cows are vegetarians, number one. Number two, then you're forcing them to basically eat their friends. I mean, maybe they weren't friends, but eat their own kind.
It's cow cannibal.
And then they started to get mad cow disease, but then they found that that could be transmitted into the meat that was eaten, and then people were getting it. Yeah, so there's, again, figuring those things out. They found that most of the time cooking the meat would get rid of that protein, would actually like denature that protein. So if you're somebody who likes a medium or medium rare or rare kind of beef, there's a lot of things you're leaving yourself susceptible to, right? E. coli, prions, yeah. Okay, so what prions do is they can cause holes in the brain to develop. So here you have a healthy brain, nice and big, causes shrinkage in the brain, causes the holes in the brain to be bigger. The mad cow disease caused bovine spongiform encephalopathy. So that's what caused the mad cow. It caused the cows to like act crazy. That's why they were mad cows. They were like, right? Their brains were getting shrunk and getting holes in them. And then there's other diseases like Creutzfeldt-Jakob, transmitted in humans, and scrappy in sheeps. So lots of research, more research to do. All right, so I think